Today's discussions will be presented in three sections since we are recording it for radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. You're welcome to post questions and comments during these sessions, and we'll try to answer them online. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jason Miller of Federal News Radio.
Welcome to the discussion. The panelists today are Dave Bennett, the Chief Information Officer at the Defense Information Systems Agency, Harrell Watkins, the Chief Operating Officer and Director of the Office of Technology Operations and Planning at the Environmental Protection Agency, Bill Zielinski, the Director of Strategic Programs at the General Services Administration, Randall Conway, the Principal Director to the Deputy CIO for Information Enterprise at the Department of Defense, and Prince Anand, the Director of Federal for Insight Public Sector. Gentlemen, welcome to the program today. Before we get started, let me set some context for our discussion. The Obama administration's fiscal 2017 budget request was to create a $3.1 billion IT modernization fund. It created a huge buzz in the federal community. The White House gave the proposal a big boost in early April when it teamed with Congressman Steny Hoyer to propose and plan to introduce legislation to create this fund. Now, the $3 billion fund would work in a very straightforward manner. The Office of Management and Budget would create a board to choose, oversee, and manage agency projects. Tony Scott, the federal CIO, told me recently that among the major evaluation factors the board will use are whether the business case includes good cyber hygiene, the adoption of more modern technology, and shared capabilities. Now, OMB has been clear it will not fund every agency's modernization projects, nor will be the main source of funding for those projects, but it will get agencies over the notorious hump of needing seed money to get started down a path of modernization. So whether or not Congress supports this fund, OMB is ushering in agencies down a path to modernize their IT. A draft memo working its way through the interagency comment would give departments a set of deadlines to prepare to submit business cases for the fund. A major piece of this effort would be for every agency to come up with at least 3 high-priority systems based on OMB's criteria. OMB is encouraging agencies in this draft policy to submit more than 3, but a minimum of 3 projects to be modernized. But IT modernization is happening beyond the buzz around this $3 billion fund. Agencies are under pressure to consolidate and optimize data centers. This leads to CIOs looking at network and application modernization efforts. In the end, the goal for OMB and agencies is to swing the pendulum away from legacy systems and more toward modernization efforts. The current breakdown is about 76% to 24% legacy spending to modernization spending. And federal CIO Tony Scott knows the change in that ratio would mean better security, better services to citizens, and therefore better government. So with that context in place, let's begin our conversation. Once again, our guests today, Dave Bennett, the Chief Information Officer at the Defense Information Systems Agency, Harrell Watkins, the Chief Operating Officer and Director of Office of Technology Operations and Planning at the Environmental Protection Agency, Bill Zielinski, the Director of Strategic Programs at the General Services Administration, Randall Conway, the Principal Director to the Deputy CIO for Information Enterprise at the Department of Defense, and Prince Anand, the Director of Federal at Insight Public Sector. A lot going on in IT modernization. It's a hot topic. We know that. I'm going to turn to Bill. I'm going to do a little dance here and start in the middle of the panel. Start with Bill. Bill, you were at OMB. You now are at GSA. You really were, if you will, a big force behind this modernization effort. So let's just talk about it. And agencies need to evolve. We know that. They need to meet the current and future workforce's needs. How is this big modernization effort taking agencies down that path?
So, Jason, I think there's a few things. As you mentioned, I was at OMB for a period of 6 months where I was directly working on this modernization fund plan. I think part of it really starts where Tony Scott talked about kind of the vulnerabilities when we went through the cybersecurity sprint and really started taking a look at kind of the issues and challenges that are there. A very large theme was in order to be able to secure the systems that are out there and really kind of improve the security posture of the federal government overall, really needed to be able to address what they have in terms of their IT assets that are out there today. And that theme really was that there's a need to modernize, but there are challenges in being able to get this, as you said earlier, the seed money to start them along that path. The reality is that if everybody kind of goes along the path as we have traditionally done this, with everyone taking each particular system and modernizing them, there's not enough time nor is there enough money to be able to do that because technology will move along at a much faster pace. So this really becomes then kind of the starting point for this fund to say, how do we really get that money in place, but also how do we have a mindful plan that allows for us to do this in an effective and efficient way so that we're not simply kind of continuously caught in this loop of modernization.
Randall, let me turn to you for a second from a DoD's perspective, and Dave, I know you'll weigh in as well, but from your perspective, the modernization discussion, as Bill said, not enough money, not enough time, and really if you wait too long, in your case, the warfighter is the one that gets affected, and that's who really, in the end, there's a mission in every agency. Talk a little bit about how DoD is taking a look at this modernization to make sure it's going down the path to meet the warfighter's current and future needs.
That's a good question. We have several projects underway to do IT modernization or national security systems modernization in the department. One of the things that we're doing is with our tactical radios. There's a huge modernization plan in place to get all our tactical radios up to a certain standard, and with new ComSec communication security equipment. And we have what we cause in the larger Defense Information Systems Network, we have the Joint Regional Security Stack infrastructure that we're going to put in place, which is this midpoint security apparatus across the department to try to, get us to be more secure in the midpoint for lateral and north-south movement of information. And then, of course, we're trying to get ourselves on board with the Windows 10, Microsoft Windows 10 initiative to get all of our endpoint user equipment and a lot of our server systems upgraded. So we have in our budget, we have to do sustainment, we have to do modernization, and then we do research, development, test, and evaluation. And so it's always a struggle to balance the resources to do all three of those things. But basically, all of our modernization right now is geared towards cybersecurity, and that's really the essence of where we're at with it. We get that with Windows 10. We're going to get that with the Joint Regional Security Stack and all the 5 components that compose that, and we're getting it with how we modernize our tactical radio systems for our warfighting platforms. So that's really what we do. We spend an inordinate amount of time trying to balance those areas because we have so much legacy equipment in the Department of Defense inventory, and modernization is costly, and it's just we always struggle with the best way to go about it.
And I'm not sure there is the best way, right? I mean, everyone talks about best practices, but because every agency is so different. Let me turn to Dave Bennett from DISA for a second. You're obviously working closely with Randall in terms of on several of their projects. GRSS comes to mind as one. From DISA's perspective, there's kind of 2 modernization efforts going on. There's DISA's internal one, which you guys have done a reorg recently, and then there's the external one where you're helping the services and DoD agencies. Talk a little bit about your efforts.
Yeah, so back to Randy's point, it's modernization of both hardware and software. You can't really do one without the other, and so we've got to stay focused on taking care of both pieces of the puzzle there. In my role, I have to not only modernize for the department at large in terms of the IT infrastructure and software and applications, but I have my own internal network for the agency that's a global network in and of itself. And so I'm a consumer of those same things I have to modernize. So I have to not only think about what does the department need and how do we make sure that things are interoperable, but I also have to think about it from an end user of those capabilities. What am I going to have to change in my infrastructure? What am I going to have to change software-wise to make certain that the capability is going to perform like it's expected to? And so while you're talking about the bringing in of new capability, new latest software, latest technology, et cetera, the other piece is we've got to make sure that we're testing as we go through this process, because whether we bring in a new platform or we bring in a new software baseline such as the Windows 10 environment, we're spending a lot of time just doing the interoperability testing to see what capabilities break or don't break when you bring in this new software. So it's a cycle of life, if you will, that you have to look at this, not just bring in the capability, but what does it do to what's out there, and then how does it support the warfighter going forward?
Let me turn to Harrell from EPA. You heard Dave kind of talk, he brought up the end user, right? He brought up the idea that you don't want to break anything. At EPA, your end user is really the state and local governments. It's the private sector businesses. So you're worrying, again, very similar to what DoD is. You've kind of 2 customers going on. Talk a little bit about your modernization efforts at EPA.
Sure. So one of the things that, I try to do from my perspective is certainly reduce that spend on the legacy systems, right? So everything that I deliver from an infrastructure perspective to try to reduce that cost overall. The other areas that we're focused on primarily are around user-centered design. You mentioned state and local. We have a huge contingency working with state and local environmental agencies, and so we have to be able to reduce the cost of IT for our mission area components of the agency. And one of the ways we're looking at leveraging to do that is certainly leveraging the cloud is a big thing for us. How do we leverage that infrastructure that's out there that's ready to go, that's secure, that's been FedRamped, and so we can use those for a lot of agency applications. Meanwhile, we're also rationalizing a lot of our internal smaller applications that help us with a lot of administrative type functions. There's a lot of duplication there, so we're looking for opportunities to where we can leverage off-the-shelf software in some of those cases, and in other cases, just kind of use more agile methods for design and iteration of those applications.
So interesting, kind of different perspectives. Let me turn to Prince Anand from Insight Public Sector. You heard kind of different perspectives. I think Harrell brought up a couple things that was interesting, user-centered design. You heard Dave bring up workforce, Randall bring up workforce, and Bill gives that big picture. Just kind of what's your takeaway, the initial?
I think Bill mentioned tech is moving at a very fast pace, right? So what are the primary drivers for all of a sudden that picking up pace? We see two primary reasons. Number one is you're changing workforce, which means that how existing workforce wants to use the technology today versus how the incoming workforce wants to use the technology. So it's an interesting challenge for all of the CIOs. How do you keep both of them productive, right? How do you deliver something that is going to work for both of those? Secondly, of course, the attacks on the security side have become very, very sophisticated. So how you used to think about your legacy systems, now there has to be a mindset change because those hackers are becoming more and more sophisticated by the day. So I think now industry is catching up to that, and that's what's driving a lot of that need for change.
Prince, you brought up something that I want to kind of pull on that string a little bit, the workforce change. DOD sees this all the time. You bring in new recruits, 18 to 20-year-olds. They want something different than the colonels or captains who are 35, 45, 50 years old. So, Randall, just looking at you for a second, how are you dealing with that two different push and pull? Because people don't like change, but some people say, I'm not going to come if you don't change.
Well, we're doing a lot with mobility, and with DISA especially. A couple of years ago, we started an unclassified and classified mobile phone, basic mobile device capability that was, and we kept our BlackBerry. We've been on BlackBerry for many years. We still have that today. But we took that on for this very reason, the change in the workforce. And they wanted more mobile platforms to do their business. They wanted tablets. They wanted more choices in what type of mobile handheld device to use. They wanted apps to choose from. And they wanted to be able to plug in wherever they went. And so we're taking that on. We're even doing something pretty creative in the Pentagon right now with we're putting in a Pentagon wireless network so that we can make it, Pentagon's a pretty big place, and it's for moving around in that building there, wouldn't it be nice just to pull up your calendar and just see what's my next meeting, and you can do it online versus walking around with a book of paper. And so
I've heard the walls are thick too.
And the walls are thick. And so, but anyway, so that's a big move for us. But yeah, I think it's the mobility. It's the new technology and the devices and what they bring to the table that's caused us to change. And it's that new, younger workforce that drives that.
Harrell from EPA.
Yeah, certainly. A lot of what we've done also is we've spent a lot of time updating our mobile infrastructure from BlackBerry to using Apple devices and Windows devices primarily. We've also spent a lot on wireless connectivity throughout the agency. So certainly in our regional offices and also at headquarters. We also have a thick wall problem as we reside in a fairly old building. So obviously, that presents some challenges. As far as the workforce, we certainly have an older workforce. We have a younger workforce as well. But the key thing that I try to, particularly mobility and the collaborations tool that we have deployed, is really supporting what I call the boots on the ground, the folks that are out there when there's an environmental situation, when they have to respond, ensure that they have that tablet or that mobile device and it's working for them to be able to collaborate instantly back to any emergency operations center. And so that was a primary driver for us, improving our availability for those things.
Dave?
Yeah, so in the agency, we put the unclassified mobile device out there as well as the classified on behalf of the department. And so it is central to where we're going. I mean, everything we're doing right now to include looking at new capability and looking at security, we're coming at it from a mobile platform perspective and making that central to how we do things. But as we do that, it brings along the increased cyber threat, not only from an application perspective, but having signals hijacked, if you will, as you go across the wireless environment. So we just have to do the due diligence to ensure that the capability is going to do what you want it to do, but it's also secure at the same time.
Prince, it seems to me all the panelists are talking about the need for these devices that change a little bit, but really it's what they're not talking about is the network change that also has to happen. Bill's shaking his head. So Prince, start us off with the change in the network as they're modernizing to support these.
Yeah, so in terms of network, I think more and more there's a demand for wireless, right? But then that in itself becomes a challenge. How do you secure communications on those wireless networks? Because as the younger workforce is coming in, they have that sense of instant gratification, if you will, right? They don't want to go back to their desktop to check what the next meeting invite is or how that's going to happen. So I think the legacy networks have come a long way, right? Remember, it used to be 1 megabit or even 28 kbps modems going way back to gigabytes, right? So wireless networks are also evolving now in terms of the bandwidth as well as the security, right? As we get to that point, we see more and more of that moving in that direction especially as we address the security concerns. So bigger need now in terms of applications are becoming a lot more richer. So the bandwidth requirement is 10, 15, 20x as what it used to be. So that's also going to continue to drive need for bigger and bigger bandwidth because now you have to change your applications as well as, to how you want to consume them on mobility means more graphics, means more pizzazz, if you will, that will increase the need for the bandwidth.
All right, so let's stop there for a second. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to pick up with Bill about, because you play with GSA a central role in helping everyone buy these technologies to meet the needs. You're listening to the panel discussion, Pillars of Modernization in Government, sponsored by Insight Public Sector on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.